Hello survivors and welcome to Now That's What I Call Survival Horror, the first aid spray show where we discuss the soundtracks of various survival horror games, including Resident Evil, including in this episode in particular, the classic Resident Evil 4. My name is Sai and joining me on this episode is Mr. KDB.
Hello.
And if you haven't seen an episode of this show, how this works is KDB has listened thoroughly to the Resident Evil 4 soundtrack, gone through, picked out his favourite pieces of music from the game, numbered them from 10 down to 1, and we're going to go through those, we're going to listen to those, we're going to talk about them, why he picked them, what makes them stand out, so on and so forth. It's all an opinion-based show, so if you disagree with Kelsi's picks, then that's fantabulous. Get in the comments, let us know what he missed that you thought was deserving of being on the top 10, or what should have been where, so on and so forth. Let us know how you feel about the Resi 4 soundtrack. Before we jump into it, Kelsi, this is really quite an interesting pick in a way because, I don't know, speaking from my opinion at least, it's not a Resident Evil soundtrack that jumps out at me. And we've done quite a few episodes of this show at this point, and we've focused on a few different eras, but we haven't really dug into the sort of mid part of Resident Evil at this point, if you like, the sort of action-focused stuff that's kicked off with RE4. So this is going to be kind of interesting, kind of fresh, kind of new. But yeah, why you picked Resident Evil 4 specifically? Any reason why that was?
I think, well, mid is the right word. I really wanted to do RE4 because I have a strange relationship with the game where I loved it when it came out, and then more recently, I definitely don't hate it. I've just softened on my love for it, and I thought, because I didn't get to do the main podcast, chat about the game, this is an opportunity for me to, talk about the game a little bit, but come at it from a completely different angle that certainly I've never really focused on either. You say it doesn't jump out at you. It's never jumped out at me, bar perhaps one or two tracks. So I just thought
this is a really interesting episode because people have picked games where they're like, I love this soundtrack and here's why. Whereas you've kind of gone, I don't really have a whole lot of feeling about this soundtrack. I need to understand why.
It's completely that. This is one of the most challenging things, I've done for first aid spray. So yeah, there's some mixed feelings. I'm not trying to say I'm gonna sit here and be really negative because I'm not, because there's lots to like. So yeah, I really wanted to kind of challenge myself with this and dive into it and give it a chance that maybe I guess I'd never really given it before, I suppose.
Okay, cool. Well, in that case, what is your number 10?
Number 10 is Del Lago. So this is a bit like Jaws meets Resident Evil, specifically Resident Evil 1, I thought. It sounds like it could be a bit... it could have been like the Neptune boss fight in Resident Evil 1. But then as far as Jaws goes, it doesn't quite have the, the da-dum, da-dum build-up, but you can hear the influence. You can hear that pumping sort of Jaws, dun 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 dun. Those kind of those drums, and then that mechanical piano. And that piano is definitely the best part about this. And yeah, this is just a sort of, I thought, of all the music, on this, there's a lot of short tracks. There's a lot of very similar tracks. This soundtrack often takes itself very seriously, I think. And this is one of the more fun is the wrong word, but it just. I think it's got those obvious reference points, like I say, Jaws, and it's just constantly coming at you, a bit like The Fight. It's basic and simple, but I thought this was a strong number 10 for Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, fun is definitely not the right word, but I know where you're coming from, certainly, in the sense where that sort of imposing piano rhythm that you get is just the shark sound now. Like, I mean, Del Lago isn't necessarily a shark, but without that kind of thing, if you were watching a film or playing a video game and there was a shark attack and you didn't have like a dun 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 dun, you'd probably be very confused. It's just, it needs to be there. So in that way, it is kind of like, oh, you know, when you play it and you're like, oh yeah, there's that. Big wall of sound, this one.
There's a couple of points in this soundtrack where, you sort of mentioned, sharks in movies and stuff. There's some movie stuff in this soundtrack, and when the soundtrack does stuff like that, that's when it's strongest for me, and that will kind of become clear as we go on. So it's a simple opener, but Del Lago, number 10.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because it is a good place to start because it's got this big wall of sound to it, which is something that's definitely going to come up multiple times throughout this, I'm sure. But also, it's quite interesting to think about this as sort of being like a reflection of what the boss themes of the series would evolve into a little bit from this era. Like RE5 has this kind of like sound as well, a little bit, sort of swarming sort of sound. You can kind of hear the jump from the orchestral pomp of the earlier games boss fights in this, but it's just really dense and really, as you say, sort of its era movie making wise as well. It's not video gamey. It is much more sort of filmic mood piece.
Yes,
it's sort of designed to make you feel a certain way rather than sort of be a catchy piece of music, make you tense up and make your hair stick up. So in that way, it succeeds.
Yes, orchestral pomp. Yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that going forward. Okay, number 9 is Ganado 1. Okay, so I almost didn't include this one because of what my number 8 is. But yeah, repeat listens kind of got it a place on my soundtrack. There's something really creepy about it. I have almost no idea how this has been created. You mentioned Wall of Sound, and this is definitely one of those tracks. There's loads of stuff like this on the soundtrack, but for me, this is one of the stronger uses of that style. So in terms of how it's made, it's like some kind of synth, and then possibly they've like recorded noises in an empty building, just like smacking a wall or something like that. And either way, it's really clever. And yeah, there's just kind of this big piston industrial steampunk stuff, and it doesn't really go like with the Ganados for me, but the music is just so weirdly creepy and something that I really enjoy. One of my notes I put is something like, so off like a metal or electro album, but like an interlude, so like 9 Inch Nails or Slipknot, like one of those weird interlude tracks of just noise.
Every Fear Factory album ends with about 9 minutes of this.
There you go. There you go. And you know, you say Fear Factory, it has a factory line feeling about it. It has a Fear Factory feeling, and that I guess ties into, you know, how the Ganados are. They're like this big army of robots under Salazar, not Salazar, Sadler's spell was sort of one thing I thought of. But yeah, this is I've kind of expand on this when we get to number 8, but yeah, this is so weird wall of sound stuff. Really, really enjoyed it. It's got something to it, this one.
I agree in that it feels more like it's about a bunch of machines than people. And I think one of the appeal of the Ganado, even over the sort of the lowly zombies, is that they are actually closer to human beings than even zombies were. That being said, there is a sort of, and I think I use this comparison for, funnily enough, the factory in Village, but there is a Borg sort ofness to the Ganado.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the hive mind of enemies that come at you no matter what.
Yeah.
And they are a bit more mindful, the zombies. They're a bit more organised, but not by a whole lot. So I guess it kind of suits it in that way. But you're right. It is a weird one. I wouldn't necessarily like if you detach this from the game. I wouldn't necessarily go, oh yeah, that's the music for Ganado. Like,
No.
I don't know. There's no way I would have guessed that.
Yeah.
It's, if anything, if you had just presented this to me and I had no context, I probably would have said it's from a Silent Hill game, not Resident Evil, with all that machinery clunking sound effects. But yeah, like the last track, it's a nice and uncomfortable swell of music. But yeah.
I didn't want to be as brazen and say it could be in Silent Hill, but I completely agree. You mentioned the factory in Village. That was one of the notes I didn't even bother saying. It would not be out of place in Heisenberg's factory.
Absolutely.
It's got that vibe to it. So yeah, I was looking at my list as well, just to sort of, I'm not going to mention any jumping ahead, but my numbers are a bit, as I've gone back over my list, I thought, oh, maybe I could have swapped that round and swapped this round. Like, this could have just as easily been my number 10, I think, and then number 9 being Del Lago. But I'm not going to lose too much sleep over that. But yeah, I thought this is. I've opened with what I feel is the two routes that this soundtrack takes, which one is a bit more sort of classical horror stuff, and then there's this one, the Ganado, which is this weird industrial style that the soundtrack goes for, not counting the few bits of Latin stuff that are over the soundtrack, which are completely separate. Okay, so number 8 is Ganado 4. So yeah, this is basically like development of, the previous track. I think there's 5 of these on the album, Ganado 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So this is number 4. For me, this works way more better for the Ganados. I can't quite place it in the game. I think it's in the castle, and I think it's with the robed guys. So you're kind of more aware of what's going on at this point, and you're more used to them, and it's just got something more sort of horror about it and less mechanical than the previous one. It sounds like a bad dream. It has again that same production weirdness where I'm not exactly sure how everything was made. This one's definitely a bit more in your face than the previous one, which is what I like about it. I've said before on these things, I like when although I enjoy subtle music and weird music and stuff, I sort of always find myself preferring the more in your face, cheesy is the wrong word, but just the more sort of emphatic stuff, and this has a bit more emphasis to it. Very twisted, migraine like that. It's got pulsating bass, and then there's this like one of the first times this appears on the soundtrack, it's like this stretched vocal, which it's like a synth, but it sounds like stretched vocals, and there's echoey pads as well, which is like all encompassing and cloudy. What else do we have? These little jingly shaker things that sort of creep in and out every 30 seconds. And for tracks on this album which are more atmosphere based and less like music track stuff, this is one of the better ones for me, because there's a lot of just atmos on this soundtrack, and this is one of the strongest ones. I really, really like this one. It develops on the Ganado 1, and is way more horror.
I wrote ambient noise more than anything, certainly, and I really like the description of it's like a bad dream. That's very appropriate. It's sort of like structureless in a way that feels very horrid. It's very hard to keep a hold of it or keep track of it. It's just kind of like moving around you. It's very hollow feeling. I think you're right. It's probably the castle. I can very much picture that in my head. I don't have a whole lot on it other than that, to be honest. You're right. It's more appropriate for the Ganado, and it's particularly appropriate for the sort of cultist aspect that you get to later into the game.
Yes.
Certainly. It's funny, actually, as a fellow Halo fan, I don't know if you necessarily picked up. I know we just said Silent Hill, but that stretched vocal thing really reminds me of the stuff they use a lot for the Flood in Halo.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered that, but yes, yeah.
Not a horror series, but like when you come across the Flood in Halo, you get that sort of mood from it certainly, and that comes across a lot in the soundtrack that they use to sort of reflect that species, and you get some of that in here as well. Just sort of like really messed with vocals, whether it started out as a vocal or not, but it sounds like one. Yeah, it works really well for the Ganado in the same way. Again, sort of parasite-y and stuff like that. So yeah. It's certainly
I wonder
one.
that, because there are, you can do insane things with synthesizers where you can essentially create what sounds like voice with synthesizers if you tweak it enough. And I like to imagine that they've sat there and groaned and made noises in the booth and then tweaked it afterwards, because I think that to me that sounds way more fun, and also I think it then gives you a sort of texture that you don't really get with synthesizers. I watched there's some behind the scenes stuff for this game online that you can watch, like interviews with the devs and stuff, and they on more than one occasion are very clear about how they not like went balls to the wall, but they went out of their way to try different things for this game, and that, like, across the board, they thought that the series was recycling ideas and stuff, which, okay, fair, but when it comes to all aspects of this game, they just kind of went all out and tried lots of things. So I can absolutely imagine them sat there just going, like in the booth, and then going in and twisting it and adding reverbs and stuff like that and chucking it in the track like this, and that's why it gives the impact that it does, I think. Okay, number 7, Serenity. So, yes, we did Tear-Death Experience, where we did save room themes, and this officially, according to First Aid Spray, is one of the top 4 save room themes in the franchise. I think it's number 4, actually, and I agree. I previously said on a previous Now, I thought the top 4 save rooms were this. So here we are. It's on my top 10. I'm going
to bleep that, by the way, so that we don't spoil.
Okay.
So that anyone...
Spoiler alert.
If you haven't watched that save room theme, here you go. There it is, right up there in the annotation. Go click it. Here it is. It's on my list. Again, for me, this is very Resident Evil sounding. It did take a bit of a hit when I realised it sounded a lot like Resident Evil Zero's save room as well, but I sort of ignore that. Here, I like it. I like it a lot. So you hear it, it's the save room. It's not called save room, it's called Serenity, and it's there when you see the merchant as well. It plays. And yeah, it's dreamy. It sounds like something Bjork might sing over, which is quite nice. It's bizarre. It's like... I think it's something about the variation in this, as in contrast to the rest of the really dingy, dark horror stuff on this soundtrack, which is why this just sticks out to me. This was always going to be on the list. It was just kind of figuring out where it was going to go. What else? Yeah, recovery vibes, which makes sense. Save room. If Rebecca Chambers was in RE4, this would be her theme, I suppose. And yes, and also I think it sounds a bit like a hip-hop track without a beat, and I can imagine a rapper sort of spitting about their dead homies. Rap albums, even the most gangster of rappers will have a track on their album that makes you want to cry because it's about their fallen brothers and stuff like that. So that was just the kind of vibe I got from this. I would wager that somebody out there must have done that, have put a beat to this and rapped over it. Absolutely. Somebody has done one for the blimmin' DualShock soundtrack. So why not RE4, the biggest game in the series? But it Dingy is a fun word. Dingy is a fun word for the soundtrack in general. And I would still say this is dingy, but I agree that it's not necessarily a horror piece. But what's interesting about what you were saying to me is that there's some like sadness to this piece of music to me that I don't know where that comes from. There's something about the melody in this that sort of dips in between sort of hope and despair, the way that it moves around. Sometimes it makes you think, I'm all right. Next bit, I'm going to be okay. But also, there's something about it that makes you really think about the situation you're in. And I guess in retrospect, maybe not so much on your first playthrough, but it makes you think about the Ganado and the villagers that they were, with those really sad credits at the end of the game that kind of show you their story about how they basically just got roped into this. It makes me think of that. I don't think it was designed that way intentionally, but for some reason, something about this piece of music, it's very morose, and I get sort of that part from it. It's not quite as recovery feeling for me as a lot of the other save room themes, but as a memorable piece of music, I will stand by where we placed it when we ranked them. It's absolutely in the top 4 save themes of the series. 100%, yeah. And it deserves to be in the top 10. I might have even put it slightly higher myself, but it's your list, so...
Yeah, and I've said my numbers are a bit all over the place, and I definitely, looking back on this list...
It's a really hard soundtrack to rank, I'll give you that much.
It really, really is, and... this could have definitely been higher. I think you hit the nail on the head, with the sadness stuff. And, that's Resident Evil save room themes for the most part. The good ones, it's sort of, I'm safe, but oh God, no, not really. So, yeah, really strong one, this. And, yeah, it could have easily gone higher. Okay, number 6 is Death from Above. Yes, so this is used in the game when the ceiling trap comes down. I think when Salazar drops a ceiling trap. And for me, it just it's way more tense than it has any right to be for that section of the game. And for a soundtrack that is, this whole soundtrack that is often understated, this is more up my street, with the atmosphere type stuff. The horror strings are in this, and they appear in quite a few more of the following choices as well. That elevated heart rate stuff, vibration stuff. I've said that this stuff weirdly sounds a bit like the Dark Knight movies as well.
Yeah. And before they came out, wasn't it, I think?
Yes, it was. It absolutely was.
Yeah.
And this ties into another comment, which I can say now, which I was going to say later, but this early to mid 2000s movies, particularly horror movies as well, there's a lot of... I'm not going to say formulaic. It's not formulaic. There was just a style and tone where everything went from the bright and colourful, campy 90s. The 80s were in the past, and then the 90s were pushed out the way, and everybody wanted to be serious, and then dark and experimental and stuff like that. And we could sit here for hours and list lots of movies and games and stuff that are a bit like that. Movies in particular, and we know Resident Evil draws from Hollywood movies all the time. So... yeah. Very Dark Knight sounding, and even though it wasn't drawing from Dark Knight, it's just the style of stuff that was around at the time. This is, again, it's short. It's not a long piece of music, but this is where stuff creeps in for me that I really, really like, particularly those horror strings. And I thought this was a solid little tense piece. I also, again, felt like this wouldn't be out of place in RE3. This could have been used for a Nemesis theme. It just has that sort of... It's that elevated heart rate stuff and the chase type feel to it, which I think kind of makes me make that leap. But yeah, it's short and snappy, but a lot to love.
I can absolutely see what you're saying about the Dark Knight stuff, weirdly. But I also can definitely see what you're saying about horror movies as the time, even as someone that doesn't watch horror movies particularly, sort of the soundscape of this just makes you think of like slasher flicks of stuff of the era, doesn't it? Like those high-pitched sort of shrill violin bits sound like, Scream and maybe Final Destination. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of horror franchises from that era, but
yeah, well, we had things like The Ring and The Grudge and Darkness Falls and stuff like this. All these movies that I even think, when was the Alone in the Dark movie? That was like 2003 or 2, wasn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, 2004, something like that.
Yeah, same sort of vibe.
Yeah, it's really funny because you're right. This is really intense for like a one-off booby trap, but it's gnarly. I like it. It's a lot of the RE4 soundtracks sort of scary in a distant kind of way. Just as we said, sort of the wall and noise, the weird ambience. This is in-your-face terror. This has malicious intent. So it's really funny that it's not used for, I don't know, being hunted by the Verdugo or something like that. But it really works. It elevates that little bit from the game, I expect, and it does have a cool rhythmic pulse to it, which is a nice touch because it feels like the machine pushing the spikes down on you, which adds some intensity and some pace to the music and to the moment. Weirdly good for like a random piece of music that you hear once as sort of an incidental moment.
Okay, number 5, End of Umbrella. So I did surprise myself adding this to my list. Horrible connotations for the lore and how furious we all were that Umbrella was finished off screen. But I would say you can't really argue that it's a memorable piece of music, and it's a great piece of music and a pretty epic opener. It has... again, more classic RE littered across it is the huge big bass drum, those elongated synth notes, all this stuff that's from the original games, right at home with the sort of opening of an epic Resident Evil game. And certainly I could hear this being used potentially at the beginning of 3. It doesn't quite have those thumping action beats of the previous 2 mainline games, but it definitely has this epic sort of tragic event has happened, and we should all be so very sad about the fall of Umbrella. But I think it despite what they actually did here with Umbrella, putting that aside, I think the music is nailed for the section and what it's trying to say. And
yes,
it's I feel kind of bad for them looking back. They probably thought, it's weird that they made this choice, and they just probably thought people didn't care as much as we all did. We didn't want to take down Umbrella, but we all did. We didn't get to. As frustrating as that is, this is a great opening piece of music. I really, really like it.
This is as iconic to me in its own separate way as RE3's opening monologue. Definitely. As cheap as a narrative device as it can be, I'll be honest, I like a good opening monologue, especially in a cheesy video game like Resident Evil, where you just want to get into the action, so the cutscene just goes, here's a quick lore dump, right, off you go. It works. And yes, of course, I was as infuriated as anybody by the content of this cutscene was, quite famously, because RE4 I avoided for a long time. But yes, you can't deny that it's a great piece of music. It's got the definite RE classic feels to it, all those things you mentioned. It's got some brass in it as well, which gives it a nice through line to RE2, where Leon first debuted. And it also has, getting to sort of the end of the piece, it starts to feel like a sort of cop show, spy mission, appropriate sort of tone for Save the President's Daughter. I think it's just really good cinematic music that fits the tone of Leon as a government agent now. He's a bad enough dude, etc. Before you get into the game and get to the actual horror. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
To be honest, it's great.
I hadn't
and then
even
immediately
thought about
after
that.
this, you get Spanish flamenco guitars. So
Yeah,
you
I was
listen to
just
this and
about
not...
to say. I was just about to say that is perfect because you've got your intro, you've got your. I was going to say sitcom, but no, you've got your weekly cop show that Leon's the star of. Every week opens with this monologue. Okay, I'm being sent to here this week or whatever, or this has happened, and then in stereotypical fashion, the music of that culture will suddenly start playing to tell you, by the way, you're in Spain. By the way,
yes, this week we're in Spain. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. If you're in England, we suddenly get the sort of Queen type music playing in front of Big Ben. So, yeah, that's exactly what.
I don't believe I'm saying this. I really want the Leon government agent TV show now. Thanks.
Well, yeah, maybe it would make us all a bit more endeared to him. But anyway. It's an odd choice. Like I say, surprised myself that I chose it, but this soundtrack is huge. I will say, it's another double disc one because there's obviously lots of music on, Mercenaries and Separate Ways and things like that. And I've focused on the RE4 main game music for this list when I could have easily strayed sort of out of that. There's so much music on this, and I am being very positive here. That it was hard to get this top 10, but this track in particular was another one where I thought, I probably won't include it because of what it means. But then as I was going along, it was just like, no, it's just sticking. It's gonna be on my list. So, I do apologise for everyone that's angry at this cutscene. I'm angry too, but yeah, the music's good in a vacuum. Number 4 is Bad Vibes. It's quite funny to me that in 2004, whenever this came out, there was a track called Bad Vibes. I don't know about you,
I had the same thought. I was like, wow, what a track name. In 2022, I might expect that, but...
This is surprisingly sort of, forward thinking of the RE4 soundtrack. Vibes, bad vibes, good vibes. What's the vibe is very much the stuff that, sort of... It's like it's in the lexicon these days. Bad vibes. Again, okay, so this is, super horror movie stuff again. This is just before the Verdugo fight. There is a longer piece of Verdugo music after this that plays like during the fight, which is good, but it was just a bit more sort of repetitive. This is the kind of intro to the sequence. I'm sure that's what it is. And it's super impactful. It feels again that this could have possibly been in RE1. I know I've said that a few times, but this is where and all my choices are these same sort of things. I've got a couple of those atmospheric ones, but there's so much other stuff on this soundtrack that does not sound like it could have been on RE1, 2 and 3. I just haven't chosen a lot of them, so I like this more hard-hitting stuff. And yeah, those high-pitched violins, they're back again in this. I've got a real soft spot for that. It's the sort of ghostly paranormal stuff that you hear quite a lot. That's what those violins are, and it's all present here. It's just creepy and chilling. That's my horror flavour. And it could be seen as overdone, could be seen as camp, as I say. But yeah, for me, it still works. Never loses its charm. That stuff. Yep,
I agree. I love this. It does feel like Resident Evil 1 in a way. Like, this would fit onto the remake soundtrack specifically very well. In the same way that remake really hammers home all of its movie influences and stuff. I mean, I know it's very obvious to say, but the Verdugo is pretty much the Xenomorph, which is appropriate then that this music has a real alien feel to it. It's got all this banging and crashing that sounds like something moving around an event, which, again, appropriate for what happens in the boss fight. So that's obviously a big positive in its favour. It sets the ambience, sets the mood very well. And yeah, it is like old Scary because you can sort of, even though it's not got a traditional musical structure, as it were, which is what we talked about a lot with the classic soundtracks, you can follow this piece of music. It's got all these long notes that bend as they go, which is very classic Resi. Is just a good scary piece of music. I don't have anything more to say other than that. Thoroughly approve.
Yeah, you're right. Good scary piece of music. Number 3 is Bitores Mendez. Okay, so this, just like so we're on to my final 3 now, my top 3. I will say that these top 3, any of them could have been number 1. These are easily my 3 favourite tracks coming up now. But this, just pure classic horror, John Carpenter type stuff. Those, I just mentioned them on the previous one, screechy, chilling strings, they're back here, so it gets my attention. This feels even more supernatural than the Verdugo stuff. And what this does, which wins it points for me, is it mixes some of that industrial stuff that's spread around the rest of the soundtrack. It's in this a bit more than the previous track we just listened to.
Yeah.
So it's a really weird mix. But yes, this is like both of the styles really coming together in the best possible way. Oh my god, the best bit. So those vocal stuff is back, but this one's even more horrible than the stuff earlier. So they're like vocal sounding pads and reverbs. It sounds like people screaming. I encourage everybody to listen to this with headphones on. It's terrifying. It's one of the scariest pieces of music on the soundtrack, and it's suitably so for the boss fight. He's one of the best sort of monsters in boss fights in the game. The design of him, demon type stuff, which is good. That's what this music is. He's like a demon and a monster. The iconic spine shot, which is in the remake trailer as well. They know how impactful this guy is, and I think this music is a big part of that. Yeah, this is awesome horror music. This could have been my number 1. It definitely could have been my number 2. I'm looking now, and I think I could have easily swapped them round, but yeah, one of my favourite pieces off the soundtrack.
Yes, it's kind of cool that we talked about Ganado 1 earlier on, because this is like that, just turned up a lot. Really intense, really thick with that, strange mix of industrial sounds. And John Carpenter is definitely, we can make that reference point a lot throughout just talking about horror music in general. But there is something about this that makes you think of all the sort of transformation scenes in The Thing and stuff like that. It just makes you... Something about it is really uncomfortable. Which is... Yeah, and the screaming is a big part of that. And it adds to almost certainly the most memorable boss fight of the entire game. And I suppose it helps because it's a little bit earlier on. It's like the first of the sort of 3 major ones when you think about Mendez, Salazar and Sadler. So certainly that helps. A lot of people definitely played this part and will remember the sort of flaming shack with this dude that splits in 2 is terrifying, sort of in your face terror moment. This piece of music at this point is like nothing the series has done before, which is again really throws people off, which is great. And it's a great example of how Resident Evil 4's soundtrack being just masses of swirling noise that make you feel out of your depth.
Yes.
Adds to the terror of the game, because the game it's not tense in the way the old ones were, where, you could make a mistake and you've lost loads of progress sort of thing. The game's fun to play. It's got good gunplay, whatever you think about the tank controls or how it might have aged. But at the time, obviously what made it connect with people and change the industry was just that it was just really nice to play. So a lot of that horror had to come from other places, and the music does some really heavy lifting for the scary, certainly. And this, quite possibly the scariest piece of music in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right with that, where the gameplay is such a big focus, and I'm one, to look for the horror in these things. I've mentioned it a few times in this soundtrack, and this is just, this, no matter what I think about Resident Evil 4, and I do like this boss fight, one of the best fights. It's probably the most difficult one as well. It's really tricky to do this one because it's that confined space. And this music is great. I cannot wait to see how this is in the remake. I mean, it's going to be a big moment. So, yeah, love this. Could have very easily been my number one. I'm looking at my number two now, thinking, well, it should have definitely been my number two. But here we go. We've just, I've got it in number three. Now. It's a strong 3. Okay, so number 2, Salazar. So this isn't really a Resident Evil piece of music, but it's so good. This is so where the previous track is very sort of how could I describe? Well, I mean, we said Carpenter and stuff like that, and that kind of horror. This is gothic horror, and that's because of the church organs. This church organ goodness. Your fate will be sealed. This type of stuff. This is this could be from like End of Days or something like that. This is I actually can't believe it is so high on my list because of some of the other stuff, but it just has some fun and texture to it that a lot of the other very brief tracks are lacking. I've mentioned all those short tracks that are on this soundtrack. But it's also so versatile. Like you could imagine this in so many different types of gothic and horror games. Easily, without a doubt, one of the most Hollywood pieces of music on the soundtrack, which is perfect given Salazar's love for movies. It does well to feel like that churchy classic horror. I'm thinking of what's the series Midnight Mass that was on last year that was incredible, by the way. If you've not seen that, everyone go and watch it. This could have been in that show. It's got modern percussion with the classic horror church organs. Another one that caught me by surprise. This is a big number 2. I love the previous track we just talked about so much. I do love this one for very different reasons. The previous track scares me. This is such a blast, this one. It's got horror to it, but it's more fun and there's more traditional maybe. I don't know. It's just this is all over the place, but in a really, really good way. Very, very powerful.
I like this a lot. As you say, there's a lot going in on this one compared to a lot of RE4's soundtrack, which is a lot of strange, unknown noise that it's hard to pin down what exactly you're hearing. Whereas, you can pick out stuff like church organ and choir, and there's even some electric guitar in the background. There's a nice little rocking riff going on in places. It's, I don't know if I would say that this isn't a Resident Evil piece of music as such. It's interesting because other games that have come since have leaned more into this direction, like some of the Revelation games, for example, particularly the first one, I guess.
Yes, fair,
So at the time, maybe, but there was also Code Veronica, and this has sort of taken the bombastic ridiculousness of Code Veronica's, choir and church organ and harpsichord soundtrack and just made it darker and creepier.
No, this is true. I think I'm just so stuck in 1, 2, and 3. I just forget sometimes. You're right.
But I mean, to be fair, like it's not something that RE4 does a lot. So it's certainly it's interesting listening to it now because it does stick out. But when I play the game, it's weird because it never really stays with me after playing the game. But that's odd because it is really good, and I remember the feeling of that boss fight. For better and for worse sometimes. So it's a memorable boss fight and the way that it makes you feel, and obviously the music's a part of that. I think in that way, in the way that I wasn't like, oh yes, this is the Salazar boss theme. I just listened to this and went, okay, that's apparently what it is. I don't remember that. But in that way, this might well be the most underrated pick on here, I would say. I don't see people talking about this much at all. But you're right, it is really good, and it was really suitable for that point in the game.
Yeah, it's very different to a lot of stuff on the soundtrack, like you said. And I kept listening.
That boss fight is weird. So it's, yeah. It sounds like just casually turning into a plant, as you do.
Yeah, he goes all poison ivy on us. I listened to this a lot this week, and this one makes me, though it scares me, it makes me smile as well. So
yeah.
Okay, number 1 is Save Room. So not too much to say. Well, I got a few things to say, but the plain
I hope so. It's your number
simple
one pick.
the plain simple truth is, this is the first piece of music I think of when I think of RE4.
Yeah, that's a good reason. Yeah,
which sounds pathetic given some of the stuff we've talked about today, but it's iconic. You hear it so much through the game, and despite hearing it so much, it never annoys me. I always enjoy it. I've playing RE4, I will sit for 10 minutes and have breathers, like checking my phone or something like that, while this is on the screen, where it says your results from the chapter. It feels very at home as a Resident Evil save/results screen. And although it's not horror, this is Resident Evil 4 to me. It's what I think of. It's where my mind jumps to. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not trying to take the piss. I mean, maybe I did pick it out of spite a little bit to say, like, this is my list and this is going at the top. But would you expect anything less from me? I picked Front Hall for RE3 as my top music spot. So, I think it was always my number 1. I wrote it down. I was like, well, that's probably going to be number 1, as like laughing to myself. And then I just kept it there. And I love those previous 2 pieces of music and some of the other stuff we've talked about. But this is when someone says someone says the words RE4's music, this is the first thing that pops into my head.
Yes, I think that's fair. Like, the reasoning is sound, certainly. And I'm the same. It's this and Serenity are the first 2 pieces of music that will come to
How
head.
funny is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true of almost everyone, surely. I don't think you'd have many people disagree that this deserves to be the number 1 spot for how memorable and how recognisable a piece of music it is. It is the most recognisable piece of Resident Evil 4 music, bar none, almost certainly. It's weird because I don't think it sits with the tone of the rest of the soundtrack very well.
It doesn't.
It sticks out like a sore thumb, but maybe that's another reason that makes it so memorable. It has massive shades of RE1's save theme more than ever. It's got a lot of nostalgic twinge to it, sort of endlessly looping harp melody, soft synths, and that kind of stuff. But there's sort of beauty in that simplicity. And it is a respite from Resident Evil 4's walls of sound. We couldn't rank this on Tear Death Experience, obviously, because despite being called save theme, it's not the save room theme. Serenity is. This is, as you say, the piece of music that plays during your results when you get an option to save. So it's interesting to wonder where it would rank among the save themes. I think it would be certainly up there.
Yeah.
Despite being really simple and... dare I almost, and I mean this with no sort of harshness, almost generic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's just, there's something about it that's just very memorable, and you just go, yep, that's Resident Evil right there.
Yeah, I agree. And through doing this, I've sort of come away. I'm not going to get scathing about RE4 because though that the soundtrack has never really left an impact on me beyond this track and Serenity, it's like I've done this. I'm like, hey, the soundtrack is actually, it's pretty strong, but you have to appreciate it. I think you have to sit and listen to it. It's not really a soundtrack that will stick with you as much while playing the game, because the ones we're saying that stick with us are the ones where you sat back and relaxing and listening to it. Yeah, I think they got very experimental with this soundtrack, and some good, some bad, but when it sings, it really sings for me. And yeah, I'm not trying to be funny picking this as my top one. It's just, I know it's not technically the best piece of music that I've talked about today, but this is RE4. It makes me feel the warm and fuzzy feeling of RE4. It makes me feel the positive feelings of RE4.
Yeah.
Not the, oh my God, the camera controls are terrible. Not, oh my God, you know, what? I'm sorry, I'm just going to, otherwise I just go on and rant. Yeah, the game exists in this weird little vacuum, and and I guess the music does as well. I think RE4 did a lot for games in a broader sense, which I'm perfectly happy to, you know, agree with and admit. I'm grateful for all that. Did the soundtrack do much for games? Probably not. It wasn't really a part of that. But the soundtrack is good. Go and sit and listen to it with some headphones on, and you will be scared. There's a lot of stuff on this soundtrack that's very unsettling, and yeah, just it's a funny one to pick for number one, but there's lots of scary stuff in there as well. So yeah.
That being said, then, do you have any particularly scary or otherwise honourable mentions?
I do have some honourable mentions, yes. So, funnily enough, the other track which sticks out is Infiltration. So
yes, I get that completely.
Yeah, that's like the third of the three tracks. So the save room is Serenity and Infiltration, which is everyone will know what we're talking about. And if you don't,
you can hear it right now. You know it. So.
Yeah, and listen to if you don't, type in Infiltration on YouTube, and you'll straight away go, oh yeah, that one. I definitely remember that one, because you will remember it. So that, and then Novistados, which is those fly-like BOWs, which are in the sewers and the castle.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Their theme is like, it's like backwards music. It's like a backwards played melody. Really, really good. And then another honourable mention is Agony, which I did some research, was originally supposed to be the Novistados music, and it sounds very similar, but it has more sort of opera notes in it as well. So it's kind of like how the Ganado's tracks I've talked about developed. Novistados and Agony kind of does that as well, where one advances on the other. Both really, really good and really, really strong. So yeah, there's loads of good stuff on this soundtrack to this very okay game.
There you go, first aid spray, where you learn pointless trivia every time we do something. I did not know that, but there you go. Cool. Well, that is the top 10 tracks from Resident Evil 4 according to First Aid Spray, specifically Kelsi. Let Kelsi know down in the comments below what order you would put your top 10 tracks in. And of course, as always, thank you for listening. If you are hearing this on a podcast feed, that's great. First of all, thank you for hitting play. But also, what are you doing? Come over to YouTube and you can check out episodes of Now That's What I Call Survival Horror much earlier, and even earlier still if you're a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/FASprayPod. But other than that, Kelsi, thank you for joining me. Thank you for your wonderful list and this lovely conversation about Resident Evil 4.
No problem. Like I say, I've come away feeling more enamoured with the soundtrack than ever before, so it's been a joy.
Excellent. And not a flamenco guitar in sight. Thank you for watching, everyone, and have a good week. Your best note, and you left it off, by the way. You didn't even...
Oh,
My favourite thing you wrote down that I've never seen this comparison before, but I love it for RE4 is it feels like a spin-off comic. I was like, that is genius.
Oh no, yeah, that's what I didn't want to ramble on, but yeah, it does, doesn't it? You know, when Marvel do these weird little side things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah.
If Resi was the MCU, this would be like a pointless show on Disney Plus starring Bucky Barnes. You know. Okay, 25% of the viewership would actually bother to watch.
Well, add this after the end credits music on the podcast for the outtake.
Yeah, all right, done.